This. All right. Well, again, we're going to continue looking at John chapter 4 tonight, focusing attention just on the narrative analysis, looking at that together to just sort of see how we can apply principles we've learned to study narratives, how we can apply that to, a bigger story that's part of a larger book. And so here we've looked at John 4. It's one of my favorite accounts of what we're talking about here, right? Of God reaching a more remote people groups, or at least ones that were not the people of that day, the people of Israel were not actively
Mm.
pursuing this people group. And so we see an example of Jesus's heart for all nations
Yep.
in the story. So I really like that account, and then also too, just to see how John uses it in his gospel. So I wanted to do that for the next several sessions, just go through just the narrative analysis, the setting, the scenes, the characters, and the plot. And then after we finish that, we can go to, my plan is to have us go to the next genre together, poetry, and start looking at how do we study and teach poetry, because that has its own particular features and unique aspects that are important to understand when we study poetry. We don't treat poetry just like we do a narrative or an epistle, because there are some other features to consider. But for now, I wanted to just focus our attention on this example from John chapter 4, and
Mm.
doing the scene analysis, which is where we left off the last time we got together, and just focusing our attention on how to do that, going through the account. Um, Again, this is part of the narrative analysis of the story, and the scene analysis is that second step. This is, I would say, probably the longest step. It's the most involved. It's where we do the most detailed look at it as we examine the story, looking at it scene by scene. And to do that, we need to identify each scene in the story. That's the first step. And of course, we
Mm.
do that by looking for changes in the situation, which are
Mm.
typically a shift in location, a shift in time, or a shift in the characters. And so we identify each scene, and then identify or detail, note key elements from each scene. And that's what takes a lot of time. And I would say this is an important step in the process, because we're really digging deeper and focusing attention on specific things within each scene of the story. And those include the various elements we'll discuss in a minute. So we've already identified each scene in this particular
Mm.
story. And if you'll remember, uh, the story is framed by three conversations. That's how, because most of the story takes place in the same place on the same day until the very end of the story. It's introduced. Jesus is at Jacob's well. So he's at a very specific location in Samaria near the town of Sychar, at Jacob's well. And he is there. The story begins in the um, sixth hour of the day. And basically, the setting, if we were watching this story like a play or a movie, the setting would be essentially the same through the movie, right? Same location. And then it would just be a sequence of events that took place that day. But there's a change in situation through the shifting of the characters, right? The first characters in the story are Jesus and this Samaritan woman. And then she leaves, the disciples arrive. So there's a second conversation or interaction with the disciples. That's the third scene. So the first scene is just an introduction, really. We wouldn't necessarily call it a scene. It's probably more like an introduction, but I just use the term scene. Scene two is Jesus and the woman at sixth hour at Jacob's well. Scene three, still at Jacob's well, and probably, a little bit after noontime, but it's a change in characters and a different conversation. All right, so that's how we would identify it as a new situation. Now, if it had been Jesus and the woman, and then the disciples come, and she's still there, and the conversation continues in the same topic, that would not be a new situation, really. It would just be the continuing on of the scene. But in this case, the woman leaves, the disciples stay, and it's a different discussion. So what Jesus has to say to the woman and what they talk about, it's a little different when Jesus and the disciples are together and discussing it. And then we have a fourth scene where here the people of Sychar arrive, and not a lot of dialogue takes place there, but they invite Jesus to stay with them. So the scene begins at Jacob's well because they arrive, and then it continues for a couple days in Sychar. Not a lot of details are mentioned, just a couple of statements, really. But it is a new situation that the author is describing. So we identify these scenes, and again, I would frame that really in these three conversations is how John put this story together. All right. So that's what we have done so far. Then we did look at the first couple of scenes, and again with scene analysis, after you identify the scenes, then you want to give details for the key elements, key aspects of each scene. And it's I've narrowed it down to these 6 elements that I think are important to identify in trying to understand what's going on in the particular scene. So we have the setting of the scene. Again, what has changed, and I think a better way to say that is what has changed in the situation from the previous scene. Again, a setting is defined as the location, the time, the characters. The situation is when there's a change in what's happening in the scene, which could be a change of one or all 3 of those elements. Then we want to identify who are the key characters in the scene. And again, the key characters in the whole story may not be in every scene. In this case, Jesus is in every scene. He's the key character in this story. But the other characters, we don't have the same ones in every scene. All right. But we just want to note who are the key characters in this particular scene. Then we want to identify or indicate key statements that the author makes in that scene, the narrator. What comments does he make? All right, so we want to specifically note those. And then we want to note the comments made by the characters in the story, key dialogue. And when I say dialogue, sometimes it's not just the interaction between 2 people or 2 groups. It could just be one character speaking, but we refer to that in a general sense as dialogue. What does each character say? Not everything is said, but what seems to be important in what they say. And then the 5th thing we want to do is summarize the scene, which is simply just summarize what happened in that scene. Write it in your own words. What seems to be the focus of that particular scene? And then lastly, the 6th thing is I note, observations. Again, as you go through the story, we've done observations already in the first step. When we do the setting of the story, we also do observations. But every time you go through a passage, there's always some other insights or questions or things that come to your mind. And so for the scene analysis, I like to, anything that came to me that I didn't think about before or noticed before, I just want to put that here. write it down, because that may be something later that is helpful to understanding the story. So those are the 6 details or elements within the scene, each scene of the story, that we want to consider. Okay? Any questions about that? That's just simply reviewing the how to do the scene analysis here. Any questions on that? Okay, so we've already done, let me see here, do this. We have already, in previous sessions, looked at the first scene, if you will, which, let me ask Fu Wei, if you could read this, if you can see it, read scene 1, the introduction, which we identified as verse 1 through the middle of verse 6.
Okay, sure. Okay, so scene 1, verse 1. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and went away again into Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the places of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph, and Jacob's well was there.
All right. So here, what we did is simply noted this was really an introduction to the story that indicates, why Jesus left Galilee, and now that it tells us where he is now and when he is now. And as we noted last time we met, we noted it said he had to pass through Samaria, that caught our attention, and then that it was very specific about the location. He's in Samaria, in a city called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to Joseph, and Jacob's well was there. So, I mean, very, very specific, narrowing down. And we learn in the next scene why it's significant as to his location, because of what comes about, what happens in this conversation with the woman. So we already looked at that scene. Then we moved on to scene 2. And here I'm going to ask, let's see, if you try, if you could read this first section, verses 6 to 15. And then I'm going to ask John Sheng, if you're there, if you could read verses 16 to 19, and then Pastor Philip, verses 20 to 26. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, you try if you could.
Yeah, thank you. Verse 6 or second half. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciple had gone away into the city to buy food. Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman?" For the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drink of it himself and his sons and his cattle. Jesus answered and said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. The woman said to him, Sir, give me this water, so I will not be thirsty, nor come all the way here to draw.
So why not?
He said to her, Go call your husband and come here. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, You have correctly said, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have said true. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet.
Verses 20 to 26. Our fathers worship in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be his worshippers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he.
All right, very good. Now, notice here, one thing that I like to do when I do scene analysis is sort of indicate here the different characters in the story with different colors. That sort of helps me to see what's going on a little bit. So in this case, the narrator comments I left in white. Jesus's comments are in yellow, and then the woman's statements are in green. And as we look at the conversation, we can see there's the interaction between them. So this helps me when I'm especially looking at dialogue or narrator comments, then I can focus on the white parts, you know, and then when I want to see what Jesus said, you know, looking at the yellow and then the green. And so this is just a way for me, a convention that I use to help me see the story a little bit. And so last time we met, we already went through several of the steps to looking at this scene. We identified the setting, which was Jesus sitting at Jacob's well. And then he adds to this, it was about the 6th hour. So we not only have the location, but also the exact time, or you know, close, about the 6th hour, which should be about noontime at that time. The key characters were just the two of them, Jesus and the Samaritan woman. They're the only characters there. The disciples have left. Verse 8, right? His disciples had gone away into the city. And then the dialogue, which is extensive in the scene, is what we looked at last time. I just broke it up into the 3 parts because really, as we looked at the dialogue, we noticed there were almost, it seemed like, you know, 3 topics that they discussed. And so we looked at the first topic in verses 7 to 15, which was the emphasis was on this living water and a woman wanting to to have it. She doesn't understand. He's speaking of, in a spiritual sense, but so they have this exchange. And then all of a sudden in verse 16, Jesus shifted the conversation to her personal life, very personal, and even asking, bring your husband. Of course, we see that, she confesses that she has no husband, but she doesn't say everything. Jesus then reveals that he knows her situation. And from that, she recognizes he has some special, he's a prophet because he has some revelation, some insight that she did not tell him. And then the conversation shifts to another topic related to true worship. And of course, now is where knowing the location where they're at is helpful, because they're at Jacob's well, which if we know the area, we would realize this is at the base, not far from Mount Gerizim. And if we had done our setting analysis well, we would have known about Mount Gerizim and the Samaritans and the conflict, and even that the Samaritans built a place of worship on Mount Gerizim, in contrast to the temple in Jerusalem. And so we focused our attention on that as well between them, that third discussion. And then we looked at the narrator comments, what seemed significant. The narrator noted the specific time. The narrator indicates she was alone, that Jesus is alone. The narrator points out that Jews have no dealings with Samaritans, so he wants to make sure we recognize there's a cultural problem here. And then also the narrator translated Messiah into the Greek word Christos, or anointed one. So that's what we looked at last time that we met in discussing this, but we didn't come up with a summary. So I wanted to pick up here, see what you guys think as far as how might we summarize this particular scene. How would we put it together in like a sentence as to the focus of this particular scene and what would happen? Anybody have a thought about that, or an idea? How would we sort of summarize what took place in this particular scene? Anybody want to offer a suggestion? What if I said this? What would you guys think? Jesus talks to a Samaritan woman. Would that be a good summary, you think, of this scene? Or what would be your thought?
It doesn't highlight the main point or the substance of what Jesus talked to the Samaritan woman about.
Yeah, it's too general, right? Doesn't mention the topic or focus of their discussion, right? So it would be a correct summary. It's not incorrect. Jesus did talk to a Samaritan woman, but it's too general. We're trying to, okay, what was the general summary of their discussion? Or if we said Jesus hurdles or overcomes barriers to seek out sinners. Okay, that also is true, but this one we would say this is too interpretive at this point. Okay. We'll get to that later. And this is a true comment. Again, it's a correct statement, but right now we're not interpreting the point of the story. We're just trying to uncover sort of the main, what the main thing that takes place in each particular scene. We're going to get to the interpretive part later when we do the plot analysis and then the exegetical idea of the author. So right now we have to be careful, one, that we aren't too general, but two, that we're not too interpretive and giving a meaning and interpretation of what the author's doing in the scene. Right now we're just saying, okay, what is the seems to be the main focus of what happened in this particular scene. So knowing that, does anybody have anything they might offer to make it a little more specific but not too interpretive?
I have a funny one.
Okay.
The funny one is that Jesus is in the water business. That's just
Yeah.
No, I would if I were to try Pastor Tim and say that that Jesus, but I'm not sure this is too interpretive. Interpretive is that I wanted to say Jesus revealed his identity to the Samaritan woman. Would that be interpreting it too much? Because Jesus said, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asked you for a drink, you would have asked him for the living water.
Okay. Well, yeah. What do you guys think of this one? So yeah, Jesus reveals his identity as the Messiah to this I'll just put the Samaritan woman. How's that one, you think, as far as would we add anything on this, take away anything, or I don't think it's too interpretive. I think that's exactly what happens, right? At the very end, Jesus says, I am the Messiah. So
Yeah.
we're not being interpretive, I don't think, too much here. We're just
the thing that I wasn't sure, Pastor Tim, because in between, from verse 19, verse 20 onwards, there was this little, conversation or little debate about where is the place of worship from the Samaritan woman's point of view. So I'm not sure how do we kind of put that in as well, or to include.
Yeah, because there's a discussion of living water and of worship as well. And so the question is, do we try to include those? Because that was a significant part of the discussion. And now, of course, the discussion led to his revelation that he's the Messiah.
Yes, I am he. Yep.
But yeah, that would be, again, this would be the sort of the subjective part of it, is that, what you feel would be important to include in the summary. So yeah, maybe how might we potentially add a few more details without making the summary too long? How might we add a few more details? Pastor Philip, you got any ideas? How might you modify this, or do you think it's good as it is right now? This one.
So, Pastor Yu Chai and Pastor Tim, I think as for my understanding, the title or the summary stated by Pastor Yu Chai, in my view, is the best.
Yeah, I definitely think it brings out the key idea from the scene, again, because one, that's how it ends. The scene ends with this, and of course this is a significant event. I might lengthen it a little bit myself, just to include, this is what I came up with, which again is not you know, we don't have to, this is perfectly good. I think the one Yu Chai mentions here, I added a little bit more detail just to include some of the main topics in their discussion. So I said, Jesus seeks out the Samaritan woman to reveal he's the Messiah. And then I just added this, who gives living water that brings eternal life for those who worship in spirit and truth. And now, okay, that may be a little interpretive. Again, it's hard to have the perfect response here, but I wanted to myself include the elements of the living water and the worship in spirit and truth, because those were seemed significant in the discussion.
And the seeking as well, Pastor Tim, the fact that Jesus seek her out or sought her out. You know?
Yes.
Yeah,
so
I think that is.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's important because Jesus had to pass through Samaria. And then Jesus said the Father is seeking true worshippers. So I think that this summary captured the idea that Jesus sought her out and the Father is seeking.
Yeah, that'll come in later. So yeah, I sort of borrowed from the first scene that Jesus had to pass through Samaria. So I pulled that in. We could have just said, you know, I think what you said, he reveals his identity as Messiah to the Samaritan woman would be good, and then maybe add this part. But yeah, the who gives living water that brings life. But yeah, I added seeks out just because of what happened in the first, or what was said in the first scene. So again, that, you know, borders on being a little more interpretive, but you know, it's what I went with. So, but again, what we're trying to do here is just bring together everything that happened in the scene and sort of, okay, what does the scene seem to be centered around? Not in terms of the spiritual message yet, or the author's intent yet. We're just looking at what did the author reveal to us in the scene. What does he reveal as far as the story is concerned? All right. Any other thoughts about this? And as we were going through the story last week, the scene last week, we made a few observations together that I included in our discussion. I'll just put it here just to remind us, because usually what often happens when you go through the scene analysis is you'll you know, notice things or identify things that maybe you didn't notice before or see as important before. And so what I typically will do is I'll just have I'll be just writing down as I'm going through and things come into my mind. I'll just do that. So last week, some of the things last time we met, some of the things we discussed were these particular insights or observations that we made together as well regarding Jesus, that she didn't understand the spiritual nature of the discussion until Jesus, you know, confronted her sin, basically. We talked about true worship here is really a foundational truth that he was revealing. Jesus shows his love for this woman by sharing with her. I think Pastor Dwayne came up with that. Showed his care for souls. That was just an insight. And then for me, I had a question as I was first studying this story and this scene is, how do these three topics in the scene connect together? That was a question that came in my mind. And what's the author doing by giving us these three scenes? You know, how is he developing, helping us to see the point of the story in these particular scenes? So I didn't answer the questions, but those are just ones that came to my mind. Because again, we're always we always need to be thinking, and you'll hear me say this probably almost every week, but we always need to be thinking, not just what is the author doing here, why did he put this here? Why is this scene here? Why are these elements in the scene there? Why did he put that in the order that he did? What is the author trying to show us? Why is this here? That's the key question that we need to be able to, as we study the story, be able to answer. So I'm always thinking about that. Okay, there's this whole discussion on true worship. Why does Jesus include that? Right? The conversation could have, he could have just said, right after the woman says, right, sir, I perceive you are a prophet. Right? Jesus could have revealed that he was the Messiah at that point. John could have skipped this whole section here and just gone right to the woman saying, I know Messiah is coming. He will, but he includes each element, each part of this conversation, and he has a reason for doing that. So I'm always asking myself, what's the author wanting to do here? And then sometimes I may put my own opinions at this point. I'm not interpreting the story fully yet. I'm just noticing things, making comments, interacting. What this step is meant to do is to, again, encourage this active, engaged examination and thinking about what's going on in the story and how the author is using different things in the story, what he wants us to see. So that's why we look at, okay, what does the narrator say here? Does he reveal anything that seems significant? What does each character say in this scene? What seems to be important? What interaction takes place here? And then how would I summarize all of that? That's forcing us to really think about what's going on in this particular scene. And when you do that for each scene, that I think really helps us to understand the story better. And then when we get to the plot, at that point, we're very familiar with what's been happening in the story, and we'll be able to much better identify the plot of the story and what the author wants us to see. So it's intended to encourage us to give careful examination to what's happening in the story. Okay. So before we go to the third scene, we're going to do that here in a moment. Any thoughts, comments, questions, observations that comes to your mind from what we've talked about so far? Okay, well then let's move forward and focus our attention now on the third scene. And in this particular case, I've got the scene here on your screen. And what I've done here is, again, I've highlighted the different characters, their comments, narrator in white, the woman in green, Jesus in yellow, and then we have the disciples in this particular scene, and I put their comments in blue. All right. Now, if I could get Zali, if you're there, could you please read verses 27 to 33? And I don't know, Shulong, if you can read, could you read verses 34 to 38? But Zali, are you there? Okay, maybe he's not available. You, Chai, could you go ahead and read 27 to 33?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Thank
Verse 27. At this point, his disciples came, and they were amazed that he had been speaking with a woman. Yet no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why do you speak with her?" So the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the man, "Come, see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it?" They went out of the city and were coming to him. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." So the disciples were saying to one another, "No one brought him anything to eat, did he?"
Okay. Shulong, if you're able to, can you read verse 34 to 38? And if not, I'll ask Pastor Philip. But
Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do not say, 'They are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest.' Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, that they are white for harvest. Already he who reaps is receiving wages and is gathering fruit for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this case, the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor."
all right, and then there's a shift in the next verse to the people of Sukkar arriving. So there's a change in scene. So this is the third scene, and as I mentioned, we have the narrator comments in white. The woman's comment, she makes one statement before she leaves in green, and then the Jesus's comments in yellow and the disciples in blue. All right, so what I want to do is I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to focus attention on your own first, and then we'll discuss it. We already done the setting, right? I don't think we need to. They're in the same location, right? Jacob's well. We've already really identified this in the first part of scene analysis. Jacob's well, some time after the noontime, after the 6th hour. And also now we have the disciples. There's a change in characters, really. The disciples arrive and the woman leaves. Okay. And then I think the key characters are pretty clear here, right? Who are the key characters in this scene?
Jesus Christ and his disciples.
And
Yep.
Samaritan
And the woman.
Yeah, and the Samaritan woman
Mhm.
is briefly there in the scene. Okay.
Mm.
All right, good. Okay, so now what I'd like you guys to do is just take a few minutes on your own and see if you can identify key dialogue, key statements made by the characters, and then key statements made by the narrator, and then try to summarize this scene 3, all right? So go ahead and take some time on your own to do that and come back together. Okay, why don't we start the discussion, and then we can pick it up next time we get together here for this. Okay, for the dialogue, what sticks out to you guys? Actually, let me start with the narrator. I'd like to do him first. What sticks out to you from what the narrator has to say here. Maybe I'll start with Fu Wei. Did you come up with anything from the narrator that seemed significant or important from this particular scene?
How about verse 28? So that the woman left the water pot. It seems like she found that there's something more important than his own so-called thirsty. There's a more important message to tell the citizens other than just care about his thirsty, her thirsty.
Yes. Yeah, he notes that she left her water pot, which is kind of an interesting comment. Almost seems like maybe he's saying something, yeah, as you said, more important was on her mind now. She was excited to tell the people. So yeah, good. Any others from Fu Wei or anyone else as far as the narrator comments?
And I think continue from verse 28, the second part of it is that first, she has forgotten what she was there in the first place in the middle of the day, which is to draw water. Second thing was that she has gone into the city and said to the man whom she has been trying to avoid because maybe of a social shame. And here she was talking to the man in the city.
Yes. Something more important than her own personal comfort has motivated her. Good. Anything else anybody has from what the narrator?
So
verse 30, sorry, Pastor Philip.
Oh yeah. So I thank you, Pastor Yuchai. I also point out verse 30 that because of her testimony, the city went out to see Jesus.
Yeah, and
Is
here's
it the
where,
same?
oh, sorry, go
Sorry.
ahead. Go ahead,
Is it
Philip.
the same thing, Pastor Yuchai, you want to point out? Yeah, thank you.
And here's where I would make an observation. You know, some might say, well, verses 28 to 30 really seem like another scene, right? Because it talks about the woman leaving, going back to the city, saying something in the city, and then the people in the city coming out to him. So that's like a different location. It's happening at the same time, but so we could have identified that as a separate scene, but I think it's really, you know, this is a technique used by authors and in movies where you have something going on, and then they do we call it sometimes a cut scene in the movie industry, where that is a scene where you have something happening, and all of a sudden the movie goes to another event taking place at the same time, and then it comes back to the original scene. So it's kind of like happening in the same moments, but I think I would keep it as part of scene 3, because what happens here sets up what takes place later in the story, if that makes sense. Notice verse 31. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him. So it's like the author's letting us know in the background what's happening over here is important, and this it'll be important later, but the scene is still, the focus is Jesus and the disciples. And in the meanwhile, right, this woman went back to the city, and then they're coming back. So again, technically you could say verses 28 to 30 is a separate scene, but because I think it's intertwined with this scene, I would leave it all as part of scene 3. Does that make sense? And that's a
Yep.
that's a subjective decision. You know, but again, we're trying to think, okay, that seems to be part of, you know, this particular scene, because John could have waited and told this at another point. He could have mentioned this here, right? After. But he doesn't. I think he's setting up something Jesus says to the disciples. So it's important to know what's happening in the midst of the conversation with the disciples. It seems like these events in verses 28 to 30 are important to know about, because they're going to prepare us or set us up for, it'll help us explain what Jesus is saying in verses 34 to 38. So that's the reason I would keep verses 28 to 30 in this scene. And also, too, notice he introduces the scene with the change in disciple and characters. And then in verse 27, then verse 31 and following, it's his discussion with them. So he squeezes in 28 to 30 in between that. So I think the author, John, intends for this to be like information he wants us to know about in the midst of, or as this scene takes place. Okay, so I would call it a cut scene, and I would put this down under the observations myself. You know, say something like verses 28 to 30 could be another scene technically, but seem to be used by John to set up what Jesus says to the disciples in verses 34, 38. We could call this a cut scene. You know, that's where the idea cut scene means that the story cuts over, shifts over to this event happening, and then comes back. So that's the idea. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? See what I'm doing here? Sometimes you will see that taking place in stories in the Bible or elsewhere, where the scene's unfolding, but then something else is happening at the same time that the author or the movie producer, editor wants us to know about. Okay. Anything else from the narrator that seems important or significant here? How about from verse 27?
Oh, yeah. So, yes. How about that the narrator wrote in 27,
Mm,
Jesus had been speaking with a woman.
mm.
And what does he say about the disciples' reaction?
A few amazed.
Yeah. The disciples were amazed.
Amazed. Yeah.
And I think this might be a helpful place to, you know, look at other translations and see what they said. This is verse
27.
27, right? So the New American Standard says they were amazed. He'd been speaking with a woman. The ESV, they marveled that he was talking with a woman. The New King James, they marveled that he talked with a woman. The New International, they were surprised to find him talking with a woman. Maybe compare the texts here. Oh, that's pretty small. Make it bigger. The the New American Standard, the disciples came back, and I like the Net Bible. They were shocked because he was speaking with a woman. Amazed. So I think the idea, you know, and this is an example where it might be helpful to do a word study early on, you know, in the process. That word amazed, and that's what I did when I was looking at this. I wondered, because amazed in English kind of has the idea of, oh, a surprise, or oh, wow, that's but when I looked up the word in the Greek, it actually has this idea of shock. Like, what? What's he doing? What? Right? You know, so as opposed to, you know, when you're amazed, something impresses you. That's the idea of the word amazed, you know, like, wow, look at that. So, but when I looked up the word in the Greek word, it was more the idea of, oh, what's he doing? You know, like shock. And so I think that's a helpful distinction to keep in mind. So they were really shocked at what Jesus was doing, which would match what the author said earlier, right? Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. And here the disciples show up. Jesus is talking to this woman, and it's not like they're, you know, wow, this is incredible. Look what he's doing. It's more like, wait a minute, what is he doing? You know, so so sometimes I know in our process we tell you wait, do word studies later, but sometimes it can be helpful to maybe do it at times earlier on. And I did that for this particular case because that struck me when I said amazed. What does that word mean there? Because in English it doesn't sound like it's negative, it sounds positive, but the Greek word is actually more of a negative idea. So anyway, that's something that I noticed. Anything else about that or about narrator comments that sticks out to you?
So, Pastor Tim, am I correct understanding verse 33 that disciples were saying to one another, that is, they did not understand what Jesus is saying, right?
Yeah, they were looking at each other, asking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the disciples were confused and talking to each other, which you could see that, right? That they're looking at each other. Hey, did someone bring him something to eat? You know, who brought him food? You know what? You know, so they were not talking to him at that point. They were speaking to each other. Something else that struck me about verse 27 is not just that the disciples were amazed or shocked, but then I kind of thought it was interesting that the narrator points out no one asked him, what do you seek or why do you speak with her? Now that's not necessarily what they were thinking. This is just a narrator points out these two questions that could have been on their mind. And what I was struck by the irony here of what do you seek? Because I remember, what was it? How did the previous scene, what did it talk about? It said the Father seeks true worshipers, right? for such people, right, the Father seeks to be his worshipers. And then John, the narrator, says kind of this hypothetical question. No one said, "What do you seek?" And I thought that was kind of interesting that he would say that. It's almost like he's linking, or there's an irony here that the Father seeks true worshipers, and that's exactly what Jesus is doing here, right? That's why I used the word seek in my previous summary. But anyway, the two questions that John chose to put here, you know, the disciples were shocked, but no one asked him, "What do you seek?" or "Why are you talking with this woman?" Again, those are things John made up as hypothetical or potential questions. He wasn't saying that's what they were thinking, but he brought those two questions up. So I think I don't think it was accidental or coincidental that he used that. One of the questions he mentioned was, "What do you seek?" Because he had just said, he used that word seek just a few verses earlier. So that's something that that stuck out to me from his comments. You know, it could have just said, no one said, you know, "Why do you speak with her?" Okay, that would have been understandable, right? What are you doing? Why are you talking to her? But John adds the second potential question in their minds, you know, "What do you seek? What are you looking for? What are you after here, Jesus?" Well, Jesus just really answered that question in the previous scene.
Yep.
So anyway, we're out of time for this evening, but I guess we'll have to examine the dialogue next time we meet. But any other final thoughts or comments or questions, just focused on the narrator portion here? I think we caught everything. So save what you came up with for the dialogue, because that's where we'll pick it up next time and look at this third scene and hopefully finish the next scene as well, so we can go to the next step in the narrative, or in the narrative analysis. Now, next week, actually, I'm going to be at my father's, visiting my father and mother. So I won't be able to meet with you guys next Tuesday, because I'll be with my parents. But we will, Lord willing, be able to meet the following Tuesday, and then should have a couple of weeks we can meet. I'll be in the Philippines in the last part of July, but should be able to do class with you then. So Lord willing, can keep going. But for next week, we will not be able to meet together. Okay.
Pastor Tim, you'll be going for the TMAI Asia Regional Summit in Manila?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll be there as well from the 17th to the 19th.